Hi everyone, I'm Marianne Taylor, also known as the House Detective, and in this episode I'm going to show you how I dated a house. Now I don't mean that it took me out for dinner and a movie, I mean how I used some of the actual physical fabric of the house to work out when it was built. So normally in these detective diary episodes, I show you some of the stories about how I've used documentary evidence to work out the history of a house or certain aspects of it, who's lived there, that type of thing. In this episode, I'm going to concentrate on 5 physical clues that give you information about the construction and evolution of a house. I'm going to use a case study house at Ipswich in order to do this because it contained a range of fantastic features that work really well to showcase what I'm talking about. But basically what I'm going to be doing is focusing on interior decoration, so decorative metal ceilings, a door lock, patterned rolled glass, window styles and cast iron balustrading to tell this story. Now finding the dates of these elements are helpful on 2 fronts. So firstly, they can help support the date of construction that you have come up with using documentary evidence to make sure that it all checks. They can also be used to see if any of these features were added at a later date to an existing older house, or perhaps an existing house has had an extension added and new decorative features were introduced when that was built, and then you can use the date of the features to work out when it was likely that that addition was made. Now that's the 2 main things that I would use this for. I don't generally use features like this to work out a final date of construction of the house because they were just used for too long a period. So for example, a pattern of pressed metal ceiling may have been used for 20 or 30 years, so it's not going to help you narrow down when the house was actually built. Of course, the best source of information to work out roughly when your house was built, and I always look at this before I do anything else when I'm researching a house, is to look at the style of the house, the overall style of the house. And I've actually done a video on this previously, so you may want to watch that as well. But then after you've got the style of the house, maybe you've done some documentary research and you've got a rough date of construction from that, the next step I would do would be to look at some of these features and just make sure they're consistent with the build date that you found for the house. Now, in this case example, which was a house at Ipswich, the client is looking to do some renovations on the property, and so what she wanted to do was find out what features in her house were likely to be original, so dated when the house was built, which I had worked out was about 1916. And she also wanted to know what the original floor plan would have looked like. So I'll show you in this how I used these decorative features to put some more pieces in the puzzle, to add some clues to this detective work. The owner hired me to do my pre-renovation assessment package, and I'll put a link to that in the description below if any of you would like me to do this for your house. I think it's a valuable service because it helps you understand what are important features in your home and perhaps what's been added later and is less important if you're looking to change things. Okay, that was not meant to be a hard sell, but I'm just trying to explain the context behind this one. So they'd hired me to do this pre-reno assessment. I turn up at this absolutely beautiful house at Ipswich, and as I walk in, I'm noting all these incredible features. There's pressed metal ceilings, there's this decorative glass. They're the first few things that strike me. Now, obviously, those who have followed me for a while know how much I love having a sticky beak in other people's homes. In fact, that's pretty much why I started this job. Just kidding. Not really. But I absolutely love it, and seeing all the beautiful different types of glass and different types of interior decoration and how that has changed over the years is one of the things I love most about having a peek inside old homes. But as I said, this house had a lot of great features for me to check out. So I'm going to focus on 5, as I mentioned: pressed metal ceilings, a door lock, patterned glass, style of the windows, and the cast iron veranda balustrade. Now, as you will see, the usefulness of the information provided by each of these elements varies, And one of them was just a complete red herring. It totally threw everything out the window. And the other one was really puzzling, and I'm still not 100% sure about it. So stick around and watch, and you can let me know what your opinion is in the comments below. All right, let's get started. One of the most beautiful features of this home were a number of pressed metal ceilings. There were 4 different designs of ceiling in 4 different rooms, so I was a little bit spoilt for choice in terms of being able to try and date them. We had a range of them, and we were hoping that they would obviously be patterns that were available before 1916 when we thought the house was built. Otherwise, they must have been added afterwards. Now, as I said, the problem with this is that designs were used for a long time. So for this job, I was just focusing on, were they available in 1916? So to investigate this, I trawled through a number of digitised online old catalogues, mainly for Wunderlich pressed metal ceilings. Now, if you're not familiar with this style of ceiling, it's really common in Queensland and elsewhere in Australia, but basically these ceilings start out as flat sheets of metal. They're then put into a machine, and basically the pattern is pressed into them, hence pressed metal. They came in a variety of designs, as I mentioned, and you could basically mix and match borders, the cornices, the middle feature, rose or tile, and you could come up with a number of unique combinations. The first ceiling I focused on in this Ipswich house was the hallway. This had a beautiful pattern, and I found it in a 1910 and a 1912 catalogue, and it was identified as design number 922. That was Wunderlich catalogues. So I know that since it was in these earlier catalogues, this style would have been available in 1916. The next room was the dining room, and this had a really unusual central motif in it. I'd never seen this one before. It was sort of a cherub or an angel. I was really curious about it, and like I said, I'd never come across it before, so I was really keen to find out more about it. It had the centre tile, then it had sort of a decorative background, and then it had beautiful decorative cornices as well. Well, I uncovered through looking at old Wunderlich catalogues that the feature panel represented spring, and it was from a series of 4 panels that were called the seasons. So there was obviously spring, summer, autumn, winter. This one happened to be spring. These designs were found both in the 1912 and the 1916 catalogues. So again, the ceiling in the dining room could be original since the house was built in 1916. Well, I'm pretty sure it was built in 1916. The next room was the kitchen. So this is probably not the original kitchen, but it's now used as the kitchen. And I'll talk a little bit more about what this space might have been originally and what's happened to it later on. But this unusually had, it was sort of like an enclosed rear veranda, and it had a sloping roof, but it had been covered in pressed metal as well, which is fairly unusual. It's usually only used on flat ceilings. But anyway, I searched for this design. I found it was design 1406, and it was first shown in a 1916 Wunderlich catalogue. Now, interestingly, it was a bit weird, this room, because the pressed metal was actually in rectangular strips rather than being sort of seam free over a large area. And I found out that was because it was actually a border pattern. So they'd sort of joined a number of border, long skinny rectangular border pieces together to cover the whole roof. And that may have been because of the angles. It might have been a bit easier to do it on angles rather than trying to fit a large flat panel to it. I'm not sure. Now, there was also some decorative moulding over one of the joins, and this was design number 1580, and I could only find this in the 1928 catalogue. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The cornices, though, were definitely in the 1912 and 1916 catalogue, so they too were consistent with a build date of 1916. Now, although I couldn't find the moulding pattern in earlier catalogues, I can see by looking at it, so looking at the physical clues, I can see that it sits under the cornice. So it too must be from around the same time as the ceiling lining panels and also the cornices. So it perhaps just wasn't widely advertised in the earlier catalogues, and that's why I couldn't find it. So again, the ceiling in this room, consistent with the build date of the house. The final room that had pressed metal was a room that myself and the owner were really curious about. It was at the back of the house, next to what was now the kitchen, but would have probably originally been an open rear veranda. But it was a really big room. It had decorative metal ceilings, and it had decorative glass in quite a large window. Now, this kind of decoration is really unusual to find at the back of a house. The whole idea of our old homes was you put the fancy stuff up the front where visitors would see it, and your front rooms were normally your showpieces. They were the grandest rooms, the master bedroom, the drawing room, and a dining room. So to find this decoration in a room at the back of the house, which was normally the service area, so you'd have kitchens, laundries, that type of thing. So it's very unusual to find this size room and a room with this much decoration at the rear of the house. So one of the things we wanted to find out was this room original? Was it an extension? Had a number of small rooms perhaps been opened up to create a larger room? So to do this, one of the things we wanted to try and find out was, is the ceiling original? So again, I looked through the old catalogues and I noticed again here that the centre panel was another one from the Seasons series. In this case, it was the summer panel. So, okay, I'm thinking, right, well, that matches with the dining room, which we know was from a similar era. And sure enough, I found it in both the 1910 and the 1912 catalogues. Same for the pattern that was in the background around this centre feature panel. Okay, so looking good. Now, I have to say, this doesn't prove conclusively that this room dates from that era, because there is, of course, reproduction pressed metal ceilings and they reproduce them in traditional styles. However, I was unable to find anyone who was reproducing this Seasons style and these centre feature panels that are in this room. So that sort of added another tick to the box that it was possibly original. And in terms of it being a smaller room, a number of smaller rooms that had been enlarged to create a big room, well, the ceiling was completely intact. The full border was there, the full cornice was there. Whereas if it had been a number of smaller rooms, you would have had a join, you maybe would have had two different ceilings or something like that. But this was the whole ceiling. So if it's original, then this room has to date to the same time as the ceiling, which means it has to date to the original footprint of the house. The other clue in this room was the glass and the style of the window, but I'll get to that later in the next sections. So now, just using these pressed metal ceilings, we have a rough idea of what the original floor plan of this house probably was. So as you can see, you can't necessarily use it to specifically date a house, but it definitely provides clues, and you can definitely work out if it's consistent with the house date, and it might just flag if you've made some horrible mistake with your documentary evidence, or if something in the house has changed at a later date after it was built. It was very common to actually install pressed metal ceilings over older ceilings, sometimes VJs, that type of thing. So you can never be 100% sure that it was original. Okay, what's next? The next feature that I looked at that was of interest was interesting. I had a close look at the rim lock, which was on the back of the entry door. So the entry door in itself was amazing. It was a gorgeous asymmetrical design, which is typical of houses built during the Federation era, which in Queensland I would say probably roughly dates from the 1900s to late 1910s, early 1920s. There's a bit of variety in that, but that asymmetrical style definitely is consistent with 1916. So what do I mean by a rim lock? Well, a rim lock is one that sits on the surface of the door as opposed to being recessed within the door. So a lot of our modern interior doors have the locking mechanism and the latch sort of inside or mortised or recessed inside the door itself. A rim lock sits on the surface with the locking mechanism on the back of the door, and then what's called the staple, the recess, the strike plate, the keep, on the timber surrounding the door frame or the architrave. So this lock immediately caught my attention, firstly because I know if a house has one of these great old rim locks, they also have an awesome old skeleton key, you know, like those giant skeleton keys that you see, which I think like they're a proper house key, not like the little flimsy things we have for our modern homes. But they're also a really quite interesting mechanism if you like that kind of thing, and I do. I'm very interested in how old hardware works. But basically, I took a closer look at this rim lock because I know that some of them have manufacturer stamps on them which can help you work out the date. So you can use the style and the stamp date to work out when they might have been manufactured. This lock, when I had a close look, had a manufacturer's stamp on it that said James Campbell number 60 model. So I did a little bit of research on this company and on this lock style, and Campbell took out the patent for this lock number 60 style in 1830. His company name changed in 1845, so you would think that this lock had to date between 1830 and 1845, right? No, incorrect. This was the red herring I was talking about. So when I looked into it further, I actually found this exact lock in a 1914 hardware catalogue. So this style lock was either, I don't know, stockpiled and then they kept selling it for years and years after they stopped manufacturing it, or I would say more likely they just kept manufacturing it in the old style. So there's a little warning for you all. Don't ever use one piece of evidence to estimate when your house was built, because in this case we would have been completely wrong if we thought that based on this lock the house was built in the 1830s or 1840s. But since I found the same lock in a 1914 catalogue, we can assume that it would still have been available in 1916 when the house was built, so it's not inconsistent with the age of the house. The next rabbit hole I went down in this house was decorative glass, mainly window glass I was focused on here. So it had 8 different patterns of decorative glass in this house in various windows. It also had different various styles of windows, which I'll talk about in the next section. So I started to have a look into patterns of rolled glass and whether or not you can use that to narrow down the dates of construction of a house. Yes, you can is the short answer, but just like the pressed metal ceilings and the locks, you have to be very careful because there's traps to fall into. The type of glass found in most Queensland homes or Brisbane homes is a type that's called either figured, rolled or cathedral glass, and many of you will recognise this type of glass. It came in a range of patterns, a range of colours, but one side is normally pretty flat, like not perfectly flat, a bit wobbly, and the other side will have the raised pattern on it. Now, I prefer the name rolled glass because this is exactly how it was made. It tells you everything you need to know about how it was manufactured. This type of glass was made by pouring molten, not magma, I'm always tempted to molten magma. Pouring molten liquid glass onto a flat surface within a frame, and then basically a huge cylindrical roller would press it down flat until it reached your desired thickness, exactly like rolling out biscuit or pastry dough with a rolling pin. This method of manufacturing plate glass was introduced in England in the 1830s, but by the 1850s they'd got a little bit more fancy and they were now putting patterns into the glass. So same process basically as making the original glass, but this time the roller had a pattern embossed or cut into it, and as it rolled across the setting glass, this pattern would be transferred and pressed into the glass. So you would end up with one flat side and one side of the glass with a pattern on it. Some of you domestic gods and goddesses would be familiar with a similar process where you can buy those patterned rolling pins that you use on dough or thick icing, and as you roll it over, it presses the pattern into the dough or icing. So exactly the same concept. Once the glass hardens, you then have this beautiful flat piece of glass with a pattern on one side and a flat back. And depending on what minerals you added into the glass, you could have it in a range of different colours. Although glass was being manufactured in this way from the 1830s in England, it wasn't actually manufactured in Australia until the 1930s. So prior to 1930, all decorative glass was pretty much imported from overseas for use in our homes here in Australia. The two main companies that supplied Australian businesses and Australian builders were the English companies Pilkington Brothers and Chance Brothers. And amazingly, there are some surviving catalogues from these companies that we can now have a look through to have a look at the designs and compare them to what we find actually still in our homes. And even better, some of them have been digitized and are available online for searching. So for a historian like me, it makes it incredibly easy to find out the names of designs that I see in houses, which is exactly what I did in the case of this Ipswich house. And that then meant that I could also estimate a date range where this style of glass was produced, and I could see if it was consistent with the build date of 1916 or not. Of course, once again, like any building feature you're looking at, old glass can be recycled in newer windows, entire windows can be recycled from older houses, so you do have to be a bit careful. Like I keep banging on about, you need to look at multiple sources and check multiple pieces of information and compare your notes on them. But for this house, I was pretty confident that the windows I was looking at were indeed original. I mentioned that this house had 8 different patterns of glass, and the glass also came in 4 different colours: blue, pink, green and yellow. So when I started to look at the styles of the glass, I identified them as Japanese pattern, which was a Pilkington Brothers design, and I found that in the 1920s catalogue. This glass was in the front door and the transom over the front door of the house. It was also in a window in the master bedroom. There was also the Morocco design. Again, I found this in a 1920s Pilkington Brothers catalogue. This was one of the side lights on the front door, and it was also one of the fan lights, and it was also in one of the bedrooms. Another style was Melusine. This was another panel near the front door, and it was also in side lights in this fantastic decorative arch in the middle of the hallway. Another style was Muranese. This was in the top of the dining room window. There was also the Arctic design. This was in the dining room in blue, and also in one of the bedroom windows in yellow. Another Pilkington pattern was called the Rimpled pattern, and this was yellow, and it was in one of the side lights in the master bedroom, which was that large room I was speaking about that we were unsure of the date of. Now, I did also find in that window a Chance Brothers design. This was the only one I identified in the house. This style was called Christelle. So you can see there, it's a lovely pattern. But the fact that this window is the only one that had glass different to the rest of the house is a little bit of a, I won't say red flag, maybe an orange flag. And the style of this window is also a bit different to others in the house as well, but I'll talk about that in the next section. So just a few little orange flags are starting to appear about this one. Now, there was one type of glass that I identified in the house that definitely wasn't available in 1916. It was a design called Kosciuszko, and as you can probably imagine from that name, it was actually an Australian produced design. It was manufactured by the Australian company Australian Glass Manufacturers. I've just really repeated myself there, haven't I? It was produced by Australian Glass Manufacturers. So I found this in a pair of French doors that led from the living and dining rooms out onto what was now a sunroom. That glass was also in the windows along the outside wall of that sunroom in casement windows. And I'll talk a little bit more, as I said, about the style of the windows next. Now, this Kosciuszko glass wasn't manufactured until after 1930. So I know just from that information, just from looking at this glass, that something's gone on in that sunroom. Something has changed in that sunroom after 1930. So that again is extra clues, extra information to add to my detective work when I look at other sources of information and when I do a bit of physical investigation of that sunroom itself. As I mentioned, all the other styles were found in the 1920s Pilkington catalogue. Unfortunately, that was the earliest one available, so I couldn't conclusively prove that this glass had been available when the house was built in about 1916, but it's sort of a 4-year difference, so you would think that it's feasible at least that this glass had been manufactured in 1916 and imported to Australia. Now, if I spent more time on that, I definitely would be able to narrow that down further, but for the purpose of this job, it was just a sort of high-level examination of the glass. In addition to the sunroom, there was also a weird extra side entry with stairs that had been added to the opposite side of the house. Now, this was obviously a later addition, and the story was that the house maybe had been flats at one stage, so I think that that's when that's been added on as an additional entry. Interestingly though, in the little foyer at the top of the stairs of this entry were also windows that had the Kosciuszko style glass in. So that also suggests that this side entry and the sunroom windows and changes all happened at around the same time. So perhaps it was all related to this house being converted into flats. And that then gives us an indication of the time where it was possibly used as flats, if that makes sense. Hope so. Okay, we talked about the style of the glass in the windows, but now let's talk about the design of the windows themselves, because this can provide information on the date of construction of a house as well. So this house had 6 different types of windows that spanned a large range of dates. So I went through and analysed each of them individually. Now, some of the windows I could tell too also had the original glass. So early glass, if you look at it closely, has a sort of wavy appearance. It's not quite perfect. It has a few little bubbles in it often, and from a distance you can just sort of see that the world is a little bit blurry. And this house definitely had some of that glass in it, so I know at least some of the windows were likely to be original. The earliest windows in the house, which are consistent with a build date of 1916 and earlier, in fact, are what are called double hung sash windows. Now, most of you who live in Brisbane or Queensland would be familiar with these. They are the most common style of window that was used in houses definitely before 1900, but up to 1920 in Queensland and Brisbane. And what I mean when I say double hung is that they were basically 2 window sashes, and they're often counterweighted but sometimes manual, but basically they can both move up and down in the same plane. Some of them, as I mentioned, use counterbalance weights to help them slide up and down, and others are manual and you have to use your muscles. Sometimes they've been completely painted over in homes now and you can't actually do anything with them or open them at all. But that's what's called a double hung sash window, and as I said, totally consistent with the 1916 build date as well as earlier and a bit later, although they were fading out of use by the 1920s. Now, the other type of double hung sash that I found in this house were what are called tripartite windows. So almost exactly the same as the ones I was just talking about, but in addition to having the central panes, they have 2 narrower lights either side. So tripartite means basically a triple window. This house had 3 of them. Yes, 3 of them. So 1 in the front dining room, 1 in the front bedroom, and then 1 in that larger rear room near the kitchen that I mentioned earlier. So these styles, again, are consistent with 1916. They tended to be used from about the 1890s all the way up to the 1920s, sort of becoming less common though towards that later end. So again, as I said, this is consistent with the date of the house. Interestingly though, my eagle eye caught this, that the tripartite window in the large master room at the back of the house was slightly different to those at the front of the house. The ones at the front had 2 panes of glass in the top half of the window and a single pane in the bottom half, whereas the one in the back bedroom had 2 panes in the top and 2 panes in the bottom. So just again, another little orange flag that's a little bit curious that this window is different to the others in the house. Now, of course, the number of panes can change if windows get broken. Sometimes you'll take out that middle divider and just put one pane back in. So again, it's not really conclusive evidence that this isn't the same era, this window, but it's just a little bit of an interesting thing to note. And of course, that was the same window that was the only one that had Chance Brothers glass in it as well. So a couple of slightly different features there. Now, it's definitely still an early window though, but what it could mean is that it was actually reused or recycled from another house and put into that room at some date. The other style of window in this house was casement windows. There was two different styles of casement. The first type were the ones that I mentioned previously that had the Kosciuszko style glass in them in the external wall of the sunroom. And then there were also similar casement windows in that foyer at the top of the side stairs that looked like they'd been a later addition. Now, this style of window with the three panes of glass would normally date to about 1920s to the 1930s. So that date is consistent with what I found with the Kosciuszko design glass, which had been manufactured after 1930 in Australia. So that would put these windows at most likely after 1930, which in turn indicates that this area had been altered and that side stairs had been altered sometime after 1930. The other style of casement window in the house were ones that had just a single pane in them. This style was far, far more common after the Second World War in the 1950s and the 1960s. You're really unlikely to have found this in the 20s or 30s, for example. So that then tells us that because they're located where the current kitchen is, this suggests that either they replaced earlier windows if it was closed in that area, which I kind of suspect it might have been because that's got that pressed metal there. It would be really unusual to have a pressed metal ceiling on an open veranda. Not entirely unheard of, but unlikely. Otherwise, this veranda has been enclosed in the 1950s or the 1960s and it was originally open. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to work that out. Sometimes that's just the case. You can't put these details together, but certainly I was able to find a number of other houses of a similar era and a similar style that had coloured sliding glass windows in this area that would have dated to when the house was built. So again, another feature, another style of window that helps us add a bit of extra information to the house. In this case, it sort of just confused things. But anyway, it's extra information, extra clues. The final type of window in this house was a clearly modern one. Now, people ask me, how do you know it's modern? And it's really hard to say. I just look at it and I know the proportions are wrong. It's far too wide and too narrow for it to have been an original proportion window. As any of you who are familiar with the houses or the previous photos I've shown of the windows, they tend to be a standard size in these old houses, and this one just looked wrong. And also having those smaller panes just is not consistent with anything you would expect to see in a 1916s house. So I suspect, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, the combination of evidence here with those 1930s windows and the 1930s glass in the French doors along here suggests that this has been an open veranda that has been enclosed sometime after 1930. And as I mentioned, there's more evidence on the exterior of the house that supports this as well. So I think that originally that end wall was probably just a solid wall and that modern window has been inserted sometime maybe in the last 20 or 30 years. The final decorative feature I investigated on this Ipswich Queenslander home was the decorative cast iron. Now, some of you will call this cast iron lace or just iron lace, but I like to call it cast iron because, again, like the glass, it tells you how these materials are manufactured. So the molten metal is poured into molds, so it's cast, and then it's left to harden and you're left with this beautiful cast iron designs. Obviously the molds come in a range of patterns, which is how you get the range of designs. Now, as soon as I saw this house, this cast iron balustrade just looked wrong. just looked wrong. It's one of those things where it's difficult for me to break it down. I've just seen so many houses now. I don't want to sound like a wanker, but I've seen so many houses now and done so much research that just immediately it struck me as wrong. When I actually started to try and break this down and then figure out why it looks wrong to explain it here, basically, I know the house is roughly 1916. It's a Federation era style, and again, that dates from roughly 1900 to the 1920s in Ipswich. And the rest of the timber decoration is really consistent with what you would expect in a house of that date and that style. So immediately it looks out of place. You've got beautiful timber spandrels between the veranda posts. You've got lovely tapered veranda posts. They have decorative capitals near the top of them, and you might have spotted that they're actually installed upside down. So the owner pointed this out to me. I hadn't actually noticed it. I probably would have. I hope I would have noticed it. It's fairly obvious now. But I don't know what's happened here, whether it was the apprentice's first day or the builder was drunk or possibly both, but they are upside down, and when you notice it, you cannot unsee it. They just look so weird and so out of place. But that style of capital, that style of post, that style of spandrel are all really consistent with the date and Federation style of this house. The cast iron just doesn't really fit with this. So I looked into it a little bit further, and basically it looks to me like the top rail seems to be in the original location. Whether it's original or not, I'm not sure. So in this era of house, you would expect to see either a 3-rail dowel balustrade. Most of you will recognise this style instantly. It's found on a heap of our Queensland and Brisbane homes. Alternatively, at this time, you would find a 2-rail slat balustrade. Now, when I talk about the rails, that's the number of horizontal pieces of timber across the top and across the bottom. And then when I talk about the dowels or the slats, that's the pieces that run between those, where the dowel is round and slats are obviously flat. Most of you will have seen both styles of this. Often when cast iron, so older cast iron is put onto a newer house, quite often a bottom rail is installed and the cast iron panels are put between them. But in this house, the cast iron was installed how it would have been originally, which means it's fixed straight to the deck floorboards. So that's something that generally would point to it perhaps have been original, but it's a little bit confusing. You know, it's also possible that it was a later replacement and that someone's just installed it the same way it had always been installed. Now, I wasn't able to find any really old photos of the house, but I did find one from 1963. And this, when I got onto Picture Ipswich. If you haven't been on Picture Ipswich, oh my gosh, you need to get on there. It is insane treasure trove of historic Ipswich photos, house photos, historical information, historical documents. It's absolutely incredible. I do not take any responsibility for the amount of time you will spend on there if you do check it out. But anyway, I trawled through there and I managed to find a photo where the house was captured in the background. I downloaded a high resolution copy of it and I zoomed right in, and I think it's very hard to tell, but I'm pretty sure you can make out that the cast iron balustrade is there in that photo, so it must have been there by 1963. It was really common in the 1980s to put fake reproduction aluminium cast iron on buildings, or to reuse old cast iron to pretty up houses that shouldn't really, from a purist perspective, have cast iron on them, that never would have been built with cast iron. But this shows that this stuff was there from at least the 1960s. So the next port of call for me was to try and identify the style of the cast iron pattern and then work out what date it had been manufactured. This might give me a clue or add some extra information into working out whether it was original or not. The other interesting thing I realised when I was looking at this cast iron balustrade was that it extended across the front of the house, but it also continued all the way down the side of the house past where those 1930s casement windows were in what is now the sunroom. Now, if you were putting a balustrade on after that area had been enclosed, why would you bother putting it along a section where there's already a wall there that's been closed off? It seems weird. It seems more like the cast iron was there already and they've just sheeted along the inside of it. but again, it's a little bit weird. It doesn't 100% make sense. So still confusing, but it does show, and looking at some of the posts confirmed that that side veranda had originally been open when the house was built. So, as I said, the next step was to try and work out the rough date that that style of cast iron balustrade was available. So I turned to my Bible, this lovely book here, Australia's Iron Lace by Brian Turner, or as I like to call him, the Bry Man. It's an absolute reference Bible if you are looking for information or the history on cast iron. It's got beautiful pictures and examples of buildings that had it on. It's absolutely wonderful, but the most important and useful feature is in the back of this book, where it contains photos and images from actual catalogues with the dates and the manufacturers. So amazingly, after flicking through it, on page, I think it's 184, yes, 184, right at the back, I found my design. It was pattern 635, and it had been registered in Victoria in 1892 by J. Cochrane and G. Scott. 1892 means it's a fairly late design for cast iron. It was definitely falling out of favour by this date, but it's a long way from 1916 when this house at Ipswich was built. It would have been quite outdated, like the style would have been quite outdated by then, but also even just the use of cast iron would have been quite outdated. But in theory, it would have been available, and it's possible that it was stripped off an older building and reused on the Ipswich house. I'm still really not sure about that. But you can see that it's quite an unusual design. I actually had never ever come across this style of cast iron before, and it's got these two cornucopias or horns of plenty, and I'm sure that there's plenty of symbolism in there somewhere. There's a sheath of wheat, there's what looks like maybe ivy, and there's fruits, including a pineapple. So combined with the cornucopias and the fruits and the other symbols in this, I suspect that it was meant to represent wealth and abundance and prosperity. There's also, you can probably see there, a horseshoe in it. Now this was traditionally a symbol of good luck, so there's also that element. If any of you know more about this type of symbolism, please let me know in the comments below, because it's definitely not my area of expertise, but I would love to know more about it if you do actually know anything, or even if you've seen this style of cast iron before. I'd be really curious to know how much of it's around. I suspect there's not very many surviving examples. So where did this leave us? Well, we've got a Federation era house built in about 1916, with all the timber veranda elements pointing to that date of construction and that style of home. And then you've got this random cast iron that was registered in 1892. Now that's the date the pattern was registered. It was obviously manufactured after that, and often for long times after that as well. So it's feasible that it could be original, that it could have still been manufactured in 1916, and maybe the people who built the house just liked cast iron. It seems really unlikely to me though. It just would have been so daggy and old-fashioned by 1916 to use cast iron. I suspect, and it's only a suspicion, I can't prove this, I suspect that it's been taken off an older house and added to this one to replace the original timber balustrades at some date prior to 1960. It just doesn't feel right. But let me know what you think in the comments. I'd love to know whether you think it's original. Do you think it's been added later? Do you know examples of houses from 1916 that also have cast iron? I'd love to hear, so yeah, please comment below. Well, there you go. That was an insight into the other side of my detective work, where I look at the physical evidence that survives and combine that with the documentary evidence to find out more information about a house I'm researching. So I think you'll agree that they are beautiful features regardless of what they can tell us. So I would love to have pressed metal ceilings or decorative glass, or, you know, some gorgeous cast iron in my house. Do you have it in your house? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear. Do you have that style of window? Do you have lovely pressed metal ceilings? Do you have any of those designs of the rolled glass? Let me know. Do you have old locks? I'd love to see some photos, or let me know. comment and share them on my socials as well if you like. I also, of course, can come to your house and do a pre-reno investigation, or I can give you some information on just identifying original features if you're interested. And finally, I just have one favor to ask, pretty please. I know that if you watch any kind of YouTube, you always get asked this. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Subscribing is free. And I'm really trying in 2025, my goal is to get to 10,000 subscribers, but I definitely can't do it without your help. So please subscribe. Please tell your friends, your parents, your grandparents, your former roommates, milkmans, pastor, tell everyone, and please share it amongst everyone as well. I'd be really grateful, and that will really help the channel grow, but more importantly, it will help more people appreciate these old homes. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.